So we're picking up after the Yalta Conference. We're looking at the death of FDR. So just as shocking as Pearl Harbor, FDR is going to die on April 12, 1945, just a few months after Yalta concluded. His health had been deteriorating. People could tell his health was getting worse and worse by this point. And so he dies of a brain hemorrhage in Georgia, April 12, 1945, actually with his mistress. But I mean, he's been president 12 years, right? He just got elected to a fourth term, so he's been president. Like, think about your lives, right? You're 16, 17 years old. Subtract 12 from that, right? He's basically like a father figure to a lot of Americans in this time period. And so, like, to have his death is a huge loss for the country. Harry Truman then becomes president, and as you know from yesterday, Truman takes over right as the war is wrapping up. And Truman has to make what important decision? To drop the atomic bombs, right? So he basically makes it to where he's the major deciding factor in that, but Truman will be the guy to drop those bombs. Anyway, so, and we also mentioned too yesterday that on the video from yesterday that that Truman didn't find out about the bomb itself until the day he became president in April, right? Okay. The last conference, the last meetings of these guys. So this is going into Potsdam. Potsdam is the last conference of the Big Three. The Big Three is going to change this time, though. So you see here at the beginning of the meeting, you still have Churchill and Stalin. Now you have Truman. So this is at Potsdam. Potsdam's a city in Germany. Germany is now conquered and being occupied by the four allies. You can see here on the map, too, where the four zones were. So you have a British zone, a French zone, an American zone, and a Soviet zone. So they're going to meet in Potsdam, which is this German city, to discuss essentially the wrap up of the war. At this point, there's no nuclear bomb yet when the meeting starts, so they're also talking about doing what by the end of the year? Invading Japan, right? Churchill, though, got replaced midway through the meeting. So they had a parliamentary election in Britain. His party lost. And so he stopped being the prime minister. And their elections are immediate. So, like, if his party loses one day, the next day the new prime minister takes office. So the guy who replaces him midstream is Prime Minister Clement Attlee, this guy right here. So here you see a photograph at the end of this with Stalin, Truman, and then Attlee. So they met here from July 17th to August 2nd. There's a lot of tension at this meeting. So there's a lot of tension between the Soviets and Americans at this meeting as well. So there's a lot of tension here between the Soviets and Americans for different reasons. So number one is the fact that Stalin is still very upset that we didn't do what for years? Open that second front, right? So he's still very upset about that. We're upset that it's becoming very apparent he's not going to do what in Europe? Or do free elections, right? We're going to be very upset he's not going to do free elections in East Europe after the war. It's becoming very apparent he's going to basically rig the elections for them to become communist. We're also upset that he hasn't started doing what yet like he promised to? Fight against Japan, right? He's been slow rolling and playing in Japan. Hasn't done it yet. When we make the nuclear bomb, when we have the atom bomb success and we begin to decide to use it on Japan, when they find out that we have this weapon, they want us to share it with them because we're allies, right? So they feel like their rights to get this bomb information from us so they can have it too. And when we say, no, that's ridiculous, they get upset. Two important decisions come out of Potsdam. One is the ultimatum we talked about yesterday in the video. So the first thing is the ultimatum. Once the bomb is made, Truman decides to give an ultimatum to Japan where it says, surrender now or face complete and utter destruction, which again, they didn't know what that looked like, but they were threatened with it, right? So that's one agreement. The second agreement was that they were going to hold all the war crimes for all the Nazi leaders after the war. The plan was to also hold a war trial for all the Nazi remaining leaders once the war concluded. And that will be what's called the Nuremberg trials. But this war ends, and this basically sets the stage for what event that comes next after the war. What's going to start pretty much immediately after World War II? The Cold War, right? So the Potsdam Conference, in a lot of ways, is signaling the beginnings of the Cold War, where both America and the Soviets are these two superpowers who don't see eye to eye, and there's a lot of tension between our two countries going into the post-World War II world from that point forward. Because Truman and Stalin both don't see eye to eye on a lot of the issues going forward. Okay, the Nuremberg trials. So the Nuremberg trials are the trials held in Germany in a city called Nuremberg, right? After the war. The first trials don't start till November. This is hugely important because in the first time in world history you have the losers and the people who orchestrated a war held accountable, right? So you're holding the people accountable for their actions in the war, which usually never was the case. Usually people do stuff in war and it's excused because it's warfare. You're not held accountable for what you do. But in this case, they are held accountable. So it's actually a series of trials, but the very first trial was the top 24 remaining Nazi leaders. This is a picture of them right here. So the Nuremberg trials, you had lawyers and judges involved from all the Allied countries, Britain, France, America, all involved in this, other European countries too. The top remaining 24 Nazis meet at the first trial. Some of them were like political officials, political appointees. Some of them were like generals, just military guys. Some of them were concentration camp people or Holocaust-related people. Just kind of a mixture of different folks. So they're held on trial here for what they did. Pretty much the unanimous defense for all these guys is they were what? They were following orders, right? If they didn't do it, Hitler would kill them, their families. They had to basically follow orders, or else, just like the military now, if you don't follow orders, everything breaks down. What does the Nuremberg trials decide about that argument? Is that good enough? No, it's not. So the argument is that that's not good enough. It doesn't matter. You're still a person, and whether it jeopardizes you and your family or not, you should still recognize that it's wrong to do the things that you did. So they rule that argument of, we're just following orders does not fly here, and that they're still going to be found guilty. So of the 24, half get executed. Half get executed for their actions. The other half go to jail for different lengths of time. Because some of these guys are just like generals who had nothing to do with the Holocaust, right? They're just fighting the war. So those guys just basically go to jail. But the rest, a lot of them go to get executed because of what they did with the Holocaust and the war itself and so on. So the Nuremberg trials end. They're gonna hold more trials beyond the first one, but it establishes this important precedent that you could be held accountable for what you do in a wartime. You're not just going to be, sign a treaty and go home, right? I don't have a blur for this, but you might want to put up Japan as well. Japan, we solely control Japan after the war. So after the war ends, only America occupies Japan. So we also have a series of trials for them too. So Tojo and some of the top officials, they will get executed. And we're a little bit more petty about it too. We actually hold a whole lot of people's feet to the fire on this. From top down, like we even put prison guards on trial in the series of trials here. But only a handful got executed. Only the top folks got executed. A lot go to jail, but not everybody gets executed. One other important decision, I mentioned this in the video yesterday too, is that the emperor, they just do what to him? They don't kill him. They keep him without the god status, right? So they allow him to stay. In fact, Emperor Hirohito remains the emperor of Japan until the 1980s. So he remains the emperor of Japan until the 1980s. But and they still have an emperor today. In fact, his son, Akihito, I think actually just is giving it up recently. I think he's about to give it up, or has already given it up to this position. But Akihito is the new emperor. Anyway, essentially it's just a what position now? It's just a figurehead thing, right? It's just like he's head of state, and that's all he is. He's a figurehead representation. Anything else for this? Everybody's good? Okay. Oop, that's not the right computer. All right. Last slide. Well, last note slide. I got a few other graphic slides. But okay, so just kind of wrapping the war up. So this is the most destructive war in world history. So this is by far the most destructive war ever. This is the most destructive war ever created in human history. For us, it cost us 300,000 Americans. So 300,000 Americans die in World War II. 300,000 Americans die in World War II. You have another 800,000 wounded. So about 1 million people in America were either killed or wounded in World War II. Way better than the rest of the world, though. So we were way below the bar. Like the Soviets have over 20 million die. China, the same thing. China has over 20 million die. About 64 million people die in World War II total. So about 64 million people die in total in World War II. America spends a ton of money on this war as well. We spend $320 billion on the war. We spent $320 billion on the war, 10 times the amount we spent in World War I. Like I said, sequels budgets are bigger, right? So $320 billion are spent, 10 times the amount of World War I. Deficit spending was dramatic, as we showed you in the graph of the day, that we dramatically increased deficit spending during World War II to help pay for all this. It does end the Great Depression, which is good. But federal spending overall increased 1,000% in the wartime. So federal spending increased 1,000% during the wartime. And we have a staggering national debt at that time of $250 billion, right? Now it's like $21 trillion, but whatever. At that time, staggering $250 billion. So a very big cost to the war. The United Nations will form as a result of this war, so no more what? What's gone? The Soviets are still around. No more what? No more League of Nations, right? League of Nations is gone. That's defunct now. It's replaced by the United Nations. We will start making it in San Francisco in April of 45. So us and 50 other countries will meet in San Francisco from April to June of 45 to make this thing. So after 8 weeks, they draft a charter. And this time America accepts its involvement. So unlike before where we said, no, we're not going to join the League of Nations, now we're convinced that America has to play a role in foreign affairs. And so now the Senate approves of us being involved in the United Nations. The first meeting will officially be held in October of 45. We'll talk more about what the role of the United Nations will be in the Cold War. But just know now that this body, the United Nations, will play a very significant role in the Cold War because you have a place where the Soviets and the Americans can kind of do what the countries here. Bully them, manipulate them, right? Isn't it an alliance? Is the UN an alliance? No, it's not, right? It's just a place for countries to kind of counsel together, right? Talk about their differences. Where does it meet today still? Not San Francisco. New York City, right? If you're going to New York City, that's where it is, right? All right. Kind of wrapping this up, expectations about post-war, and this is it. In FDR's final speech, he said, the only limit to our realization of tomorrow will be our doubts of today. And I have it on the screen. The only limit to our realization of tomorrow will be our doubts of today. And there was a lot of doubts about what would happen next. Will we have world peace forever? Will we go back to the Great Depression? But overall, things work out for America. So after the war, things work out, and we do a lot better, especially economically, once the war concludes. Initially, there were a lot of hopes that life would be better and more prosperous after the war than before. So a lot of people believe that life will be better and more prosperous after the war than before it, which will be fairly true for most Americans. But you're going to see some countries that went through the wars have to do some extensive damage repair, like the British, the French, the Germans, Chinese, Japanese, Soviets, Italians. We had nobody attack us except for Pearl Harbor, right? Where else all these other countries were bombed and just torn apart. So they're left in shambles once the war ends. And there's going to be a lot of repairs that go on there for years after the war concludes. Which is why, after the war, America emerges as a superpower, right? The British, the French, they can't because they're too war-torn. But America comes out of World War II as a superpower, where we have a massive military, massive industrial capacity. We have basically no destruction to our country at all during the war. It's just going to be us and one other country, which is what after the war? Soviets, and that's it. Us and the Soviets. Everybody else has pretty much repaired themselves. People look forward to a more peaceful and democratic world. So people did look forward to a more peaceful and democratic world. But we're going to find out that won't necessarily be true. Like East Europe, we hope to become more democratic, but what's going to happen to East Europe? It's going to become communist, right, by the Soviets. So we're going to see more conflicting goals between us and the Soviets. It's going to diminish those expectations and lead to the Cold War eventually by the next year, essentially, starting. Okay? So I'm going to show you a couple of graphics real quick. You can see these real fast. And then we'll be done. So this right here shows you spending. This is U.S. federal government size. So it goes all the way back to FDR. You see it's fairly high here during the New Deal, and it shoots up during World War II. But every president after him, going to a good chunk of Obama, pretty moderate in terms of spending. And this chart right here shows you the death counts. It kind of shows you where America stacks up. For the Allies, we're way low on this. Like America's super tiny. Like you said, less than like 300, like around 300,000 who die, right? Only 1 million casualties. Whereas like China and the Soviet Union have massive casualties and massive deaths. And even that, this is like estimations. They don't know exactly how much it is, but it's just estimations how many they lost. And the Germans lost a lot, Japanese lost a lot, so on and so on. You also see a lot of civilians die, right? Allied civilians and Axis civilians die in the war as well. Like a lot of Chinese civilians died, a lot of Soviet citizens died too. Okay? So that's it. Tomorrow's just multiple choice. Don't forget to also